Clara, Wren, and Thomas Graeme never imagined that Halloween in Hollow's Edge would turn deadly. But the moment the gold-wrapped candies appeared, their quiet town became a nightmare where every treat carried a curse older than memory. In the quiet town of Hollow's Edge, the chill of October always carried a strange mix of excitement and dread. The streets were lined with faded scarecrows, flickering orange lights, and paper bats swaying in the wind. Halloween was the heart of the town's identity, a celebration that brought everyone together, young and old, in a tradition older than any living resident. The annual all-treat parade was its highlight, a night when families filled the cobblestone streets wearing handmade costumes, trading sweets, and laughing under the watchful glow of jack-o'-lanterns. Every house was expected to participate, and every child knew the story that came with it, the legend of the Treatmaker. No one could say where the story began. Some said it came from the first settlers who built Hollow's Edge. Others claimed it was just a tale to scare children into behaving. According to the legend, the Treatmaker was a shadowy figure who appeared every 50 years, bringing sweets that were irresistible yet cursed. Those who accepted them were said to vanish by morning, leaving behind only wrappers that shimmered like gold. No one truly believed it. In a town that lived for Halloween, the legend was just part of the charm, a spooky bedtime story that added flavor to the festivities. This year, however, something felt different. The air was colder, heavier. The leaves seemed to wither faster, and even the moon carried a pale, sickly hue. When the townspeople gathered for the parade, the usual cheer was strained. Still, the event began as planned. Music played from old speakers, costumed children danced in circles, and the smell of caramel apples filled the air. Then, just as the mayor was about to close his speech, volunteers began handing out small pieces of candy wrapped in shining gold foil. No one knew where they came from, but the wrappers were printed with a grinning jack-o'-lantern logo and the words, "All treats guaranteed." Everyone assumed they were a surprise donation, maybe from a new confectioner hoping to impress the crowd. Children tore them open eagerly, and adults joined in, charmed by the nostalgia of the moment. The candy was unlike anything they had tasted, sweet, rich, almost addictive. People laughed and asked for seconds. By night's end, nearly every person in Hollow's Edge had eaten at least one. The next morning began with confusion. A few families reported that their children had slept unusually long. Others complained of dizziness and nausea. By afternoon, the town's clinic was overwhelmed. The symptoms defied explanation: fevers without heat, heartbeats that skipped and then stopped, eyes that seemed to lose their light. Doctors tested the candies but found nothing. No toxins, no chemicals, no reason. By evening, panic spread. Streets that had been alive with laughter now echoed with fear. The gold wrappers were collected in piles and burned, but the smoke rose black and thick, filling the town with a bitter scent that lingered into the night. For the first time in its history, Hollow's Edge went dark on Halloween, unaware that the real horror had only just begun. The morning after the Halloween incident, Hollow's Edge was a town transformed. The streets, usually buzzing with post-parade chatter, were eerily silent. Windows remained shuttered, doors locked, and even the children who normally ran in excited circles stayed inside, hiding under blankets. Families whispered about the strange symptoms: dizziness, fevers, and strange lethargy, and fear began to replace the shock. No one knew what had caused it, and that uncertainty made every glance outside feel like a potential threat. The gold-wrapped candies, once symbols of joy and generosity, were now seen as sinister tokens that had unleashed something no one could explain. Detective Clara Wren arrived mid-morning, her presence bringing a glimmer of hope. Known for her calm logic and meticulous attention to detail, she was the kind of investigator who followed patterns where others saw chaos. Her first step was to collect every piece of candy that remained. They had been gathered from households, burned or stored in plastic bins, but a few wrappers still lay scattered along the streets, glinting unnaturally in the sunlight. Clara examined them closely. They looked ordinary at first, but when held under a magnifying glass, faint markings appeared beneath the gold foil, tiny spirals that seemed etched into the surface itself. Curious and unsettled, Clara reached out to the town historian, an elderly man named Thomas Graeme, whose memory stretched back decades. When she showed him the wrappers, his face paled. He explained that the symbol had been seen before, on the old church's foundation stones, buried under ivy and dirt, though no one remembered it clearly. According to town records, the church had been constructed over a site with a grim past, a mass grave from a famine 200 years earlier when disease and hunger had decimated Hollow's Edge. Survivors had whispered that a stranger had appeared then, offering food to the desperate. Those who accepted never returned to normal. Madness, disappearance, and death had followed. The stories had been buried along with the victims, transformed into legend to keep the town from remembering. The more Clara dug, the more connections emerged. She discovered that every family affected by the candies had a link to descendants of those original settlers. Patterns of illness, family names, even property boundaries all overlapped with the areas where the mass grave was said to be located. The candies, it seemed, were not random. They were targeted. Clara began to understand that the gold wrappers carried more than sugar and chocolate. They were vessels, invitations meant to awaken something long dormant beneath the town's streets. As the sun set, fear thickened like fog over Hollow's Edge. The town that had once celebrated Halloween with joy now trembled in quiet dread. Clara stood in the churchyard, staring at the ivy-covered stones, tracing the faint spiral symbols with her fingers. The air was heavy, the wind whispering through the trees in a way that sounded almost like voices. She realized that the events of the previous night were only the beginning, that whatever had been stirred was patient, observant, and waiting for the moment it could fully manifest. The townspeople locked themselves indoors, unaware that the shadow of history had already begun to move through their streets, and that the curse of the Treatmaker had not been broken, it had only been awakened. Clara Wren spent the following days immersed in the town's archives, searching for any record that could explain the strange events. The old library smelled of dust and decayed paper, and the air was thick with the weight of history long ignored. She unearthed ledgers, journals, and letters written in fading ink, but one journal in particular caught her attention. It belonged to Father Jonathan Hale, a priest who had served during the famine 2 centuries ago. The pages were brittle, and the writing wavered between desperation and fear. In his final entries, he spoke of a stranger who had appeared on All Hallows' Eve, offering food to the starving townspeople. The stranger's generosity had seemed miraculous at the time, but it carried a darkness no one had understood. Those who accepted the stranger's gifts had returned to their homes, but their eyes were vacant, their minds twisted. Within weeks, violence erupted, and the town had descended into chaos. Homes were abandoned, bodies left unburied, and the priest had written of sealing the church to contain the curse. The journal revealed a horrifying truth. The Treatmaker had always returned every 50 years. Its method of influence evolved with the town, but its goal remained the same: consumption, control, and the spreading of fear. Clara realized that the gold-wrapped candies were not meant to harm directly. They were conduits, channels for something that existed far beyond human understanding. The spiral etched beneath the foil was a summoning mark, a symbol of the Treatmaker's presence. Every sweet handed out during the parade had been a carefully orchestrated part of the ritual. The fact that the town had embraced the candies so eagerly had only ensured the curse would take hold faster and stronger. Clara examined maps of Hollow's Edge, comparing the locations of affected families with old property records. The overlaps were undeniable. The areas most impacted by the candy distribution corresponded to plots built above mass graves, sites of old homes destroyed during the famine, and paths once walked by the stranger from the priest's journal. The pattern was deliberate. The Treatmaker knew the town, understood it, and had waited patiently for the right moment to awaken the past. Each house, each family, each candy wrapper had been selected to ensure the ritual's success. As night fell, Clara could feel the town's anxiety rising. The streets were empty, save for the occasional flicker of lantern light that swayed in the wind. She returned to the churchyard, staring at the ivy-covered foundation stones, tracing the spiral patterns once more. The more she studied them, the more she understood that the Treatmaker was not just a figure from folklore. It was a force that fed on the town's participation, a shadow that required attention, acceptance, and indulgence to gain strength. With this knowledge came a chilling realization. The incident with the candies was not an isolated event. It was part of a cycle, one that the town could not escape unless the source itself was confronted. Clara felt a growing urgency, knowing that whatever had been stirred was already moving, already watching. The Treatmaker was patient, but it was inevitable, and Hollow's Edge had unknowingly opened the door to a darkness that had been buried for centuries. The night air in Hollow's Edge had grown heavy, almost suffocating, as darkness settled over the town. A thick mist crept through the streets, rolling between houses and curling around lampposts, muting their glow. Every flickering jack-o'-lantern seemed to cast shadows that moved independently, and an eerie silence hung over the square where the all-treat parade had taken place. Clara Wren walked cautiously along the cobblestones, her flashlight cutting through the haze, revealing gold foil wrappers scattered like fallen leaves. Each one seemed to shimmer unnaturally in the dim light, catching her attention as though the town itself was watching her movements. As midnight approached, the atmosphere became suffocating. Windows rattled in their frames, and the air carried whispers that sounded almost like voices speaking in an unfamiliar tongue. From the distance, Clara noticed figures moving among the trees that bordered the square. At first, she thought them to be townspeople, frightened and wandering. But the shapes were wrong, pale, elongated, and moving with a strange, jerking rhythm. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the dim light from the lanterns, and every step they took seemed deliberate, as if drawn by an invisible force. Clara's gaze was drawn to the church at the center of the square. The old building, which had stood for centuries, seemed alive. The bell tower shivered, and before she could process it, the bell began to toll by itself, each clang echoing across the empty streets. The sound was hollow, resonating in a way that set her teeth on edge. The ivy-covered foundation stones of the church began to shift, as though the earth beneath were stretching and groaning. Cracks appeared along the surface, growing wider, revealing dark gaps beneath. From these openings rose a foul black air, carrying a scent of decay so strong it made Clara gag. From the broken earth emerged a darkness, not solid, but shapeless, like smoke given form. It twisted and stretched, taking on glimpses of faces, limbs, and shapes it had consumed in the past. The figures moving among the trees were drawn toward it, their glowing eyes fixed on the shadow as if it were the center of gravity. The gold wrappers on the ground pulsed faintly, as if absorbing energy from the emerging darkness, and the spiral symbols etched beneath their foil seemed to burn into Clara's vision. She realized with a cold certainty that the town had become the offering itself, a conduit for a force older than Hollow's Edge, older than memory. The townspeople who had eaten the cursed sweets now stood motionless, their eyes reflecting the same spiral marks. They moved toward the shadow without hesitation, as though entranced, their bodies controlled by a presence that Clara could neither touch nor see fully. The mist thickened, obscuring the edges of the square, and the black shape expanded, swallowing the light from the lanterns, leaving only darkness behind. Clara understood then that this was not a creature to be fought with weapons or logic. It was a force that required attention, participation, and belief to sustain itself. She took a step back, realizing that Hollow's Edge had become the epicenter of a ritual centuries in the making, and that the night was far from over. The Treatmaker was no longer hidden. It had arrived, and it demanded acknowledgement from every soul in its reach. By the time the first pale light of dawn touched Hollow's Edge, the town seemed strangely peaceful, almost untouched. Streets were empty, lanterns still flickered in their sockets, and the gold wrappers lay scattered across the cobblestones, shimmering faintly as though nothing had happened. Yet an unnatural stillness hung in the air, a heavy silence that pressed against the walls of every house. The town appeared intact, but Clara, Wren, and the few who had survived the night understood that nothing would ever be the same. The Treatmaker had come, completed its ritual, and vanished, leaving behind an emptiness that could not be filled. Search teams arrived later, called in by relatives from nearby towns who had not heard from anyone in Hollow's Edge. They found the town eerily quiet. Doors were locked from the inside, food still sat on tables, and beds were unmade, as if the residents had vanished mid-moment. No sign of struggle or panic appeared anywhere. The streets were immaculate, the square empty except for the faint spirals of gold foil that had not burned with the morning sun. It was as if the town had been frozen in time, a scene captured and left behind by an invisible hand. Investigators combed through the houses, searching for any explanation. There were no notes, no messages, no clues. Only the spiral symbols remained, etched faintly into the earth at the town square and the foundation stones of the church. Those symbols were now larger, darker, as if the night's events had burned them into the town itself. The blackened spiral at the church's base was the most disturbing of all, a mark of the Treatmaker's presence that no law, no reasoning could erase. Clara's reports, filed before her disappearance, described the events in detail, but officials were hesitant to accept them. Her last entry mentioned the figures that had moved through the trees, the shadow that had risen from the church's foundation, and the townspeople controlled by the ancient force. She wrote that the Treatmaker was not a person, but a persistent, patient darkness that had waited centuries to reawaken. Despite her detailed accounts, authorities could find no proof, and soon the area was cordoned off, labeled a contamination zone, and left alone. Weeks later, the horror resurfaced elsewhere. A small town 200 miles away reported receiving shipments of gold-wrapped Halloween candy, identical to the ones from Hollow's Edge. Families marveled at the unexpected treat, unaware of the curse it carried. No one knew how it had traveled or why, but the pattern was unmistakable. The Treatmaker was not bound to one place. Its patience, its reach, and its appetite were limitless. It moved silently, waiting for the next All Hallows' Eve to find a new town, a new group of people to feed on. Hollow's Edge had been only the beginning. The shadows of the past had spread, and the cycle of all treat, no trick would continue, patient, relentless, and hungry, marking its next victims with the glimmering foil of a sweet that no one should accept.